Sponsored by DeleteMe. You know that satisfying feeling you get when you flick your apps off your screen to close them? Or when you finally get used to gestures and realize how much more fluid they feel than buttons? How about just typing right on your home screen to find what you're looking for? Or the simple joy of dropping your phone onto a puck to charge it? It's kind of like
when you're driving and all the red lights ahead of you are turning green. Going bing, bing, bing.
Well, all those features and so many more can be traced back to a single progenitor. A phone that promised to think ahead with a name to match. When it broke cover 15 years ago, it captivated the press and made the still new iPhone 3G in my pocket seem pedestrian by comparison. But just 2 years after its debut, this phone, its acclaimed software platform, and the venerable company that spawned it would all be gone. I'm Michael Fisher. The year is 2009, and this is the story of the Palm Pre. To understand why the Pre holds such an outsized place in the hearts of tech nerds, it helps to remember the world into which it launched. In 2009, Research in Motion's BlackBerry still dominated the US smartphone space with more than half the market, while globally, the top platform was Symbian, which had just been purchased by Nokia the year prior. A big shakeup was already underway, thanks to the iPhone and Android, which were demolishing smaller competitors like Windows Mobile and Palm OS. But even those upstarts were vulnerable. Then, as now, the iPhone faced criticism for its closed nature and slow iteration, while the first Android phone took heat for its clunky hardware and inconsistent interface. So when Palm took to the CES stage in Las Vegas that January 2009, there was still an appetite for disruption in smartphones. And who better to make a play for it than the company that helped create the category to begin with? When the cloth came off, it was instantly clear that the Palm Pre was unlike any phone on the market. Comfortably thick in the middle, where competitors were slimming down, rounded like a river stone, while others were sprouting more and more angles, and packing a physical keyboard, even as the industry slowly pivoted to its virtual equivalent. The 3.1-inch 320 by 480 LCD blended smoothly into the smoky black casing, cleverly obscuring its bezels. Under the hood, an OMAP processor from Texas Instruments ran at 500 MHz, what Palm called laptop-like performance, backed up by 256 megs of RAM, 8 gigs of storage, a 3-megapixel camera, augmented by the biggest selfie mirror in the business, and an 1150 mAh battery that was removable, already an endangered enough feature to garner some applause at the time. But as impressive as the Pre was, the real star of the show was its software. A couple years before, Engadget's Peter Rojas had written an impassioned editorial urging Palm to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to optimize the smartphone just like it had optimized the PDA of a decade prior. Well, as later reported by The Verge in a story I will also link below, Palm was already on its way. The company had taken on $325 million in funding and began poaching prodigiously from big-time tech companies. Among many others, Matias Duarte, best known for his work on the T-Mobile Sidekick, was brought on to head up interface design. Mike Abbott would come over from Microsoft to lead the software team, and the 16-year Apple veteran that helped launch the original iPod, John Rubinstein, joined as executive chairman. Rubinstein would eventually petition so many people to leave Apple that Steve Jobs suggested a no-poaching agreement that Palm CEO Ed Colligan said might be illegal. The result of all this recruitment was, in the words of The Verge, perhaps the greatest talent pool in the Valley at that time. It would take them a tumultuous 2 years to build the platform that became known as webOS, but the result was an operating system that truly pushed the envelope of what a phone could do. The Pre included features that the iPhone had made table stakes: multi-touch, an accelerometer, and a WebKit browser that could render desktop websites.
There's some good articles on this site.
God, I miss live demos. But the Pre went so much further. For example, the touchscreen extended below the display into what Palm called a gesture area. That meant that apps didn't need to include a clunky back button. Instead, you went back a step by flicking to the left across the home button, and little hidden LEDs would confirm the action. You could also use gestures to scroll websites without obscuring the page with your thumb, kind of like an early version of a smartwatch's digital crown. And while you could go home using the Pre's hardware button, a swipe up would accomplish the same thing with so much more grace that the home button was eliminated from every subsequent Palm phone. webOS also challenged us to rethink the concept of a home screen. Going home didn't close an app, it minimized it into a little playing card. And unlike modern phones, where the card view is just a set of snapshots that you have to summon, on webOS, the card view was the home screen. So if you saw a card, it meant that that app was running. And unlike many phones at the time, you could run several apps at the same time. You could arrange them in a way that made sense for you, and eventually even sort cards into stacks to group similar apps together. That meant you could build a curated workflow that, to me, made the phone feel so much more personal. And since these were the days of detailed documentation of every single phone feature by fans, we got great videos like this one from Dieter Bohn showing his own preferred webOS flow. And when you wanted to close an app to free up some memory, or some of your own bandwidth, yep, that was just a flick away. Palm always kept one eye on its legacy users, too. The launcher mirrored the 3-column layout that originated way back with the original Palm Pilot. The quick action buttons from the Treo that got you into core applications were reimagined as a wave that you could summon from the gesture area at any time. Both copy-paste and the ringer mute switch came over unchanged from those earlier phones, though the ringtones themselves I've never quite warmed up to. I did love the message tone after a post-release resynthesis, however. And the notification system itself is probably the best and last webOS feature that hasn't been completely copied by modern phones. Instead of stupidly stacking up at the top of the screen in a place impossible to reach one-handed, webOS notifications appeared at the bottom within easy reach of a thumb, shrinking or expanding depending on importance, and easily dismissible at will. By the way, you'll notice I'm using several different devices to demonstrate these features. Don't worry, I'll give you a proper tour of all this hardware before we wrap up. Now, lest you think the webOS love all boils down to basically a fancy interface, Palm was thinking well beyond what happens in your hand.
Today, our stuff is all over the internet. Today, we do all kinds of things on the internet. We blog, we Twitter, we poke. You're all doing your status update right now, I'm sure.
The opportunity is to take all that information, wherever it is, put it all in one place, in your hand, be able to access it quickly, and let all of that data interact.
To marry all those disparate online presences, Palm developed something called Synergy. It pulled in and consolidated information from the web to simplify and kind of humanize your experience. Like, if you had contact information about a friend stored in Outlook and in Google and from Facebook, Synergy would merge all that data together as a single contact. When your friends updated their profile pictures, their caller ID photos in your phone would change too. And I loved this. If you were having a conversation with someone across SMS and Instant Messenger, the Pre would blend those messages into a single thread. It just made so much sense, and it was the natural next step from the company that brought threaded SMS to phones in the first place. It was also a feature set designed for a different world, when tech companies focused more on delighting users than on mining their data, and when promises like this one, from Palm investor Roger McNamee sounded wildly futuristic.
So this is the first device that actually anticipates what a person needs.
Right.
It has a clock, it has GPS, and it has your calendar. So it knows when you're late, it tells you, it can alert all the people you're going to see automatically.
Oh, another nag, just what I need, Roger.
It can bring up the maps so that your blood pressure comes down, so instead of trying to get maps while you're moving, it reduces car accidents.
Oh, and Palm was not above poking the bear. It brazenly promised users that they'd be able to sync their Pre with iTunes, because Palm made the phone identify as an iPod to Apple's software. Apple, of course, issued a patch to break this functionality pretty much right away, to which Palm responded by updating webOS to re-enable it, prompting Apple, of course, to break it again, and the cat and mouse game played out for several months before Apple finally won. Good thing we don't see antics like that anymore. Truth is, I haven't even touched on half the things that made webOS so promising to anyone who watched that keynote at the 2009 CES. So why aren't we all using Palm Pre 14s today? Well, it has to do with hardware and wireless carriers that didn't measure up, an ad campaign that, well...
At first, it kind of freaked me out.
And ultimately, a buyout botched so badly that some people continue to hold a grudge against Palm's purchaser some 13 years later.
Thanks, HP.
The rest of the story after this. It's been a little over 6 months since I first told you about DeleteMe, the simple service that gives control of your personal data back to you. In that half a year, DeleteMe has reviewed over 4,000 listings from data brokers across the web for me, and it's removed my personal information from almost 80 of them. What kind of listings? Well, we're talking private information, like my physical address history, my property and court records, even the names of my family members, now scrubbed from nearly 80 data brokers' archives without me having to do any work on my own. That means DeleteMe has saved me almost a full day searching and removing my personal information from the internet. And because data brokers are relentless, DeleteMe is too. They'll repeat the process every 3 months as long as you're subscribed. Delete your personal data from the web. Visit joindeleteme.com/MrMobile and use code MrMobile for 20% off. Thanks to DeleteMe for sponsoring this video. Fun fact, there are 2 ways to enable developer mode on a webOS phone. One of them is to type in the Konami code. Yes, seriously. And the other is to type 2009-0606. That's a tip of the cap to the Palm Pre's launch date of June 6th, 2009. And this is the first photo I ever shot on my own Pre on that very day, showing the downtown Boston retail store I bought it from for about $200 after a mail-in rebate. The line out front gives you an idea of how much hype the Pre had built up in the 6 months since its announcement, and the sign overhead tells you where some of its problems began. Sprint had a 6-month exclusive on the Palm Pre in the US, but in the summer of 2009, it was only the nation's 3rd largest wireless operator, still reeling from the disastrous merger with Nextel, which I covered in a previous episode, still losing millions of customers and billions of dollars per quarter as it struggled with network and customer service issues. Now, according to The Verge, Palm had tried to debut on Verizon, but the larger carrier backed out, which wouldn't be the last blow it dealt to poor Palm. Meanwhile, an even bigger problem was brewing just down the road from that Boylston Street Sprint store at a Boston communications firm called Modernista! Exclamation point included. The agency was engaged by Palm to craft ads that told an interesting story and, well, you can't say they failed at that.
The other day, I was walking in the park after lunch when I saw this juggler. She was very good. And the weird thing was, the more balls she had up in the air, the easier she made it look. It was a feeling I knew. Like deja vu.
Look, as a lifelong admirer of a big swing, I actually love how off-putting these commercials were. And I find that rewatching them today evokes the same atmospheric nostalgia as replaying the Windows XP installation music. But at the time, these ads were hated. So much so that they spawned blog posts, YouTube parodies, and while they probably didn't cause Modernista to go out of business in 2011, they almost certainly didn't help. I gotta say, though, that actress Tamara Hope did a fantastic job executing the utterly insane material she was given. These commercials are a masterclass in beat-based storytelling. And I'm happy to see that she continues her creative career today as the lead singer of Canadian band The Weather Station. Above all, what those commercials were trying to illustrate was this concept of a flow state, of effortlessness. But as slick as webOS was, the Pre carried a lot of compromise. I remember Endurance being so terrible that I had to regularly swap batteries, and I still almost never made it a full day. Early versions of webOS were also sluggish, thanks to the insane speed at which they had to be cobbled together to meet Palm's launch timetable. I've heard from a former Palm employee that the webOS UI layer, called Luna, was so named because employees thought it was lunacy to try to pivot to such a radical new platform so late in the game. webOS was also quite memory hungry, so my Pre would sometimes slow to a crawl and prevent me from opening new cards until I closed existing ones. And the hardware felt every bit like the first-generation effort it was, with a sticky slider mechanism, keys whose travel and feedback disappointed compared to the Trios and Blackberries of the time, and a bottom lip so sharp that Gizmodo's Jason Chen filmed himself slicing cheese with it. Back when phone reviews were fun. My own Pre started oozing some kind of adhesive from the corner of the display within a few months of my purchase, and its soft casing accumulated all kinds of scratches to go with the ever-present finger grease this plastic just loved to hold on to. Some of these issues would be corrected by future models. When the phone came to Verizon and AT&T, it arrived as the Palm Pre Plus, with double the RAM and a revamped keyboard, while the entry-level Pixie Plus added Wi-Fi to the 3G-only monoblock model that first launched on Sprint. Thankfully, each continued to prize attention to detail in its packaging.
My brother was such a big fan of these straps. You see that? That's called taking care of your customer. He was right.
AT&T would also throw in a touchstone charger for free with purchase of a Pre, which I wish Palm had done for all of them. This accessory was the brainchild of an engineer named Manu Chatterjee, whose hand I would love to shake someday. This early exposure to the convenience of wireless charging is why I continue to be such a champion for the tech today, especially now that Qi 2 and MagSafe have finally brought modern phones this feature Palm was shipping 15 years ago. Now, the Palm Pre 2 would arrive as a faster, more durable revamp in October 2010, but no amount of improved hardware could make up for Palm's ecosystem problem. Because webOS was built on open standards, the company had promised that developing apps for the Pre would be easy.
If you know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you can develop applications for this platform. In fact, one of them, Pandora, another big mobile developer, they told us that it took them 3 days to bring their application up on the Palm webOS compared to months on other platforms.
But that's just not how it worked out at scale. Palm was slow to let developers monetize their web apps and slow to provide the plug-in development kit they needed to write native apps. The webOS app catalog launched with just 29 titles. By the time September rolled around, that number had grown to just 60 apps, compared to the iPhone's 70,000. Even with a vibrant community of webOS devotees churning out homebrew apps that could easily be sideloaded, the ecosystem just wasn't taking off. The competitive pressure from Apple on one side and Google on the other proved as apocalyptic to Palm as it later would to Microsoft. The killing blow again, as reported by The Verge, was Verizon placing an order for hundreds of millions of dollars in Pre and Pixie Pluses, only to refuse shipment for the majority of those phones once it got the iPhone competitor it really wanted, the Motorola Droid. The Droid had the big screen for which consumers had begun to clamor, plus the robust app ecosystem and new features of Android 2.0 Eclair. While the Palm Pre Plus was,
First 3G smartphone, smart enough to keep up with mom. And the perfect Valentine's gift. Just $149.99 on the network with the most 3G coverage. Verizon.
So, when Hewlett-Packard announced that it would acquire Palm in April of 2010 for $1.2 billion, it wasn't surprising news. And there was even, briefly, reason for hope. HP wanted to put webOS on everything, from smartphones to tablets to printers. And when the company announced the next round of webOS products in February 2011, the person presenting them was John Rubinstein, whose presence lent the same sense of comforting continuity as the products themselves. A shrunken version of the Pre called the Veer, a blown-up model named the Pre 3, and the first webOS-powered tablet, the HP Touchpad. And despite the fact that HP seemed like a weird cultural match for the nimble and irreverent Palm,
we have a rich tradition of innovation that matters. The original HP 35 pocket calculator, the first portable PC, inkjet products.
the phones themselves seemed promising. People made fun of that tiny Veer, which was a replacement for the Pixie, but I loved it. While most small phones were, and continue to be, woefully compromised in performance, the combination of a speedy Snapdragon processor and a better optimized version of webOS meant it ran circles around the original Pre. I bought the Veer just before taking a cross-country road trip with my dad, and the camera, well, few phone cameras of the time were much good, but it did the job. The Pre 3, of course, is what most people were really waiting for. It was sleek and refined, with a higher resolution screen, a bigger, better keyboard, and an enhanced version of touchstone technology that would let it share data with a touchpad just by tapping the two together. But it was just too late to the party. Even tech nerds were beginning to tire of the form factor. Sales had never truly picked up on previous models, and the webOS app catalog still counted only 5,600 apps to Android's 200,000 and the iPhone's 400,000. It didn't matter anyway, because the Pre 3 never even got a chance to try. It went on sale on August 17th, 2011, and the very next day, barely more than a year after HP completed its acquisition of Palm, the company announced that it was terminating all webOS hardware development. The Pre, the Veer, and the Touchpad were dead. Why? Well, it's easiest to point the finger at the Touchpad, whose launch was a disaster worthy of its own video. In short, it was a tablet built to compete with the original iPad, but it was released after the iPad 2 came out. When it launched on July 1st at $499, the Touchpad was comically big, heavy, clunky, and cheap-feeling next to Apple's new iPad, which no amount of webOS 3.0 multitasking or compatibility with Citrix Receiver could make up for. But the bigger picture is that by the time HP completed the acquisition of Palm, it was no longer the same company that had sought to buy it in the first place. The notion of using webOS to make the company competitive to consumers again was the brainchild of CEO Mark Hurd. But by the time the acquisition closed, Hurd had been fired and replaced by Leo Apotheker, an executive so keen to get HP out of the hardware game that he wanted to ditch not just Palm, but the company's entire PC business. HP would shortly get rid of Apotheker too, bringing in Meg Whitman of eBay fame to try to escape whatever fever dream it had just gone through. And as you've seen on my channel, the company continues to make PCs today. But the move wasn't enough to save what was left of Palm. The organization HP renamed to the webOS Global Business Unit had already lost many of those who brought the Pre into existence. Matias Duarte left in May 2010 for Google, and Rubinstein would depart in January 2012 at the close of his contract. In the words of that former employee from earlier, It felt like we were an organ transplant, and the rest of HP was like an immune system that wanted to reject us.
Thanks, HP.
It's easy to vilify the company that bought Palm only to destroy it. But you only need to look at the ill-fated Windows Phone to see just how tough the landscape was for a would-be mobile competitor this late in the game. When not even Microsoft can effectively carve out a third-place position, despite spending years of effort and billions of dollars on a legendary hardware incumbent of its own, well, maybe once Apple and Google decided to really go for it, we were all doomed to a duopoly, no matter what. Today, webOS lives on in several forms. HP would eventually open source webOS while selling the source code and licenses to LG, so that company could use it very briefly on smartwatches before more sensibly repurposing it to anchor its line of smart TVs, which continue to bear the webOS brand today. On the open source side of things, a complete rewrite of the webOS user interface using QML called LuneOS is still in active development. In fact, it just announced its 29th stable release while I was writing this script. Some of the hardware you've seen in this episode, as well as this neat coffee mug, was donated by friend of the channel Hans, a contributor to the LuneOS effort. There's also a small but passionate community of enthusiasts who maintain the webOS archive, which includes reams of documentation, a vibrant Discord group, and even an app catalog museum. I'm not exaggerating when I say it wouldn't have been possible for me to make this video without these folks, as getting old webOS phones up and running in 2024 is no small feat. So I thank them as well for their time and generosity. But the biggest place webOS lives on is in the phone you use today.
I was talking with my friend about reincarnation.
Matias Duarte's tenure at Google resulted in the swift transformation of Android from a nerdy pile of mismatched widgets to something you'd actually want to look at day in and day out. And he's now VP of overall design at Google. BlackBerry's short-lived resurrection in 2013 was based on a platform whose gesture-based interface took many of its cues from the Palm Pre. And starting in 2017 with the iPhone X, Apple leaned hard into making iOS look as much like webOS as possible. From the bar anchoring the gesture area, to the multitasking cards, to the modern version of exhibition mode that Apple calls Standby. I'll always be a little sad that Palm isn't around anymore, but I'm grateful that its best features continue to persist in my pocket in those forms, because they never fail to remind me of the days when life moved fast, so I shouldn't miss a thing. No detail was too small, and phones were fun. Please join me for one more round of thanks to the folks up on the screen, and a special shout out to Quinn Nelson, aka SnazzyQ, whose purchase of a new inbox Palm Pre motivated me to finally get this video out the door after putting it off for nearly 4 years. Whatever video he makes is going to be amazing. In the meantime, he recorded a great podcast about webOS a few years back, which I will link down below alongside all the excellent reporting that helped me get this one together. As always, no manufacturer had any editorial input or creative oversight into this content. The lone sponsor is DeleteMe. And if you enjoyed this episode of When Phones Were Fun, well, good news. I've got 24 other episodes that I hope you'll check out. Until next time, from Michael Fisher, Captain Two Phones on Threads, thanks for watching, and stay mobile, my friends.